So I'm Davíd Carrasco, the Neil Rudenstine Professor of Latin America at the Harvard Divinity School and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and it's a great pleasure to see all of you here today for the third meeting of the Russell Banks Seminar entitled The Sacrifice of Children on the Altar of Capitalism, Bearing Witness in the Writings of Russell Banks. I'd like to acknowledge some people who've helped us get to this point today. Certainly Stephanie Paulsell, who was my co-organizer of this seminar. Dean Karen Grundler-Whitaker for her support and her arrangement of this wonderful luncheon for you today. And also Charlene Higby, who has been instrumental in many of the details. I also want to thank my good colleague from the Department of English, John Stauffer, who all of you know. Let's give him a round of applause for that great lecture he gave a couple of weeks ago. One of the gifts of having Russell Banks here has been that I got to meet John Stauffer. And we've had some soulful conversations. He's been not only a supporter, but somebody who helped illuminate the work of Russell Banks, and that's been terrific. We've also benefited from Brett Johnston's work in the creative writing program. And this HDS-sponsored event is also shared with the Department of English and the creative writing program, who have shown interest all along in the work that we're doing. 2 years ago, as many of you know, the Ingersoll Lecture was given by Toni Morrison. And in preparation for that lecture, the Harvard Divinity School introduced a method by which it wanted to have more than a celebrity visit by Toni Morrison. We organized a seminar which met 6 times so that our student staff and other people in the university would come to that lecture that Toni gave, much more deeply steeped in the work of Morrison, in her language, in her commitments, in her concerns. That was a rousing success, and we felt that this type of method, where people come really well-read in the work of the visiting speaker, really matters, and it changes the way in which we learn together. And so we've organized another seminar this time in preparation for Russell's spending this time with us, both today at noon and also tonight. Russell is coming a little bit earlier in the calendar than Toni, so we've met 3 times. This is our 3rd meeting. And many of you have been at those meetings and have appreciated the kind of conversation we've been able to have. Most of you here already know some things about Russell Banks's biography. You know about his work, you've read him. So rather than take the time and go through a list of his publications, let me first of all bring Russell to you in some of his own words, and then I'm going to share with Russell some of your words about him, which a few of you have sent to me, and then I'll introduce this panel. This wonderful panel is going to make presentations on Russell's work, and then we're going to have Russell read, and then we're going to open up the floor at some point for conversation. And so the price of your lunch here is to make sure that you keep up the spirit of these seminars and have a good conversation today. One of the passages I want to read to you from not Russell's writing but interview tells us about something that we in the Divinity School and I think in the writing program are always concerned about. And how do you find a mentor? How important mentors are. And a mentor was very important in Russell's life. And he's talking here in an interview about how he, in a sense, was launched as a writer. And he says, oh, sure, I mean, you know, I would read Faulkner, and then I would write big, long, serpentine sentences with great, elaborate Latinate diction, and realize that it was actually a much more complicated task than that. And so I would read Hemingway, and then I would write short, terse sentences with very plain vernacular English and American English, and then realize that this was much more complicated than I thought, too. So it was like that, without any sense of the work connecting to my inner self, and realizing that that's where it had to come from. Until I read the work of a novelist who's not much known these days, although he was very famous in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, really. He was a man named Nelson Algren. He was from Chicago. He had written a couple of novels that are still read and admired. A Walk on the Wild Side, The Man with a Golden Arm. And I read these books, and I felt a kind of kindred connection to the sensibility of the writer, the deepest part of the writer that I hadn't felt before. And luckily, I'm describing this as a turning point because it was. I was then about 22 years old. I was living in New Hampshire and working as a plumber, and I read about something called a writers' conference. I had no idea what such a thing was. At Bread Loaf in Vermont. And I saw Nelson Algren was going to be on the faculty. And so I sent a novel that I had been writing up there, a manuscript. They gave me a little scholarship. So I drove up, and Nelson Algren read my novel. And he went through it with me. He didn't edit it or anything. He simply said, okay, this is a good passage here, kid. Here's a good passage here, kid. And there's a nice stretch of dialogue here, kid, he said. Now you've got to write a whole book that's as good as those pieces. He said also, he kind of laid on the hands and said, but don't worry, kid, you got it. And that was really all I needed. I didn't need him to edit it for me or to go through it with a blue pencil. I needed him to give me permission. Another passage, bring you Russell. He's talking here about what's at the center of the books. There's a mystery at the center of all the books for many reasons. One is simply that it provides the engine that drives the book. It provides a quest for knowledge, in most cases, for information. I suppose, too, at bottom, I must believe that the oldest question, what is the secret of the universe, is still worth asking. And I must believe that there is not just a question, but also an answer. So the books are an attempt each time to find the answer. The mystery in the book, the literal mystery that might exist in the plot of the book, is really a metaphor for the other, deeper quest that the author is engaged in. Remember the great Borges story, The Elf? Each time you sit down to write, you hope that this will turn out to be your elf. This will be the story that decodes the universe for you, so you will never have to write again. And the interviewer says, do you often long for that? And Russell said, with every novel or story. And then one more passage from Russell that I think is relevant for us. The interviewer is asking Russell, now that he has aged some, whether it gets easier with the years to write. And Russell says, it doesn't get easier. And I don't think I want it to get easier. I'll tell you, the difference from my 20s, 30s, and now in my 70s, some things are different and some things are the same. The things that are the same have to do with not knowing what I'm doing. I still don't know what I'm doing. When I sit down and start writing, I don't know any more about what's happening in the pages than I knew when I was in my 20s. The difference is that I trust it a lot more than I was when I was in my 20s. That's the process. That's necessary. When I was in my 20s, I was scared of that. And I'm not scared of that. In fact, now I'm afraid of knowing too much. And I try to do something every time out that I don't know. That's going to push me out beyond what I know. My mentor, an early sponsor in a sense, was Nelson Algren, the novelist. So this is just a way to sort of wet our whistles about Russell's language, his approach to writing, and it may be relevant to some of us here who want to be writers still, or are continuing our writing. And some of you have had some very meaningful things to say about what it has meant to you to be in this seminar, reading more intensely Russell. Let me just read a couple of passages that you've sent to me. This is really for Russell. Suzanne Hammer writes, I read The Sweet Hereafter and The Cloud Splitter at a time when Russell Banks's compassionate, nuanced, but fiercely unsparing depiction of relationships between fathers and their children aided me in efforts to grapple with tensions in my own family. I'm grateful. Another close reader, Nancy Rockwell, wrote to me, Russell Banks's words transect the souls of the lost, revealing their nobility and their self-centeredness, their deep caring and their carelessness, their loneliness and their abiding connections in their long journeys to perdition. I mean, look, if we got students like this, who needs professional critics, right? Who can write like this? His narrator's voice is God-like in unceasing attention, a God whose eye and ear are supremely understanding but detached. In Banks' works, there's no redemptive moments this side of death. What is divine is this continual unblinking witness to the hunger and thirst of the lost for righteousness. The dead are revived through memory after the agony and passion of experience is over. As in a Southern Baptist communion, the holy power at work is remembering. Nancy Rockwell. Are you here, Nancy Rockwell? Nancy Rockwell, that's bad, that's bad. One more. Ellie Shafson provided new insight into Cloud Splitter when she compared a scene in the novel to the task she believes Banks has set for us to carry it out. When the Brown family read a harrowing testimonial of atrocity against slaves, the narrator, Owen Brown, sees this reading together, the family reading together, as a transcendent experience from which the family emerges united and transformed, a melting together and forging anew, which serves as a foundation for all that follows, because they have seen, or rather read, the beast of slavery. Ellie writes, quote, I think it's relevant that their act of reading together, that family, leads to further action. I think that's what Banks hopes to inspire as well, that his readers will not only come together in understanding, but also act, perhaps most simply and fundamentally, in the way they treat each other and live their lives. So there you have, Russell, 3 responses from people who've been here working on this, and I wanted you to hear them. I also asked my man, John Stauffer, here to write something. I have to read this because he's put together a powerful paragraph that will set the stage for what our panel is going to do. This is John Stauffer's critical reflection. Russell Banks' fiction explodes facile notions of sacrifice, heroism, and wisdom. In an interview, he said that he wants there to be heroism and wisdom, but he isn't sure they exist as human potential anymore. He should have included sacrifice, for he brilliantly problematizes these 3 concepts. In his fiction, sacrifice is never only and often not even redemptive. Heroism betrays itself as selfishness or insecurity, and wisdom seems aligned with foolishness. Banks' fiction doesn't deny the validity of these concepts, rather it highlights the uncertainty of their cultural value. It's as though the structures of his American settings, from the slave republic of Cloud Splitter to the free market capitalism of Continental Drift, have corrupted these concepts and the characters who are in these worlds. And yet there's much wisdom in his work. Few, if any, writers of any genre, says Stauffer, have written more penetratingly about what Banks has aptly termed, quote, old American weave of violence, politics, religion, and race, end of quote. Cloud Splitter, for instance, is the first in-depth portrait of John Brown since W.B. Du Bois' 1909 biography to highlight the importance of Brown's relationships, collaborations, and friendships with blacks. But unlike Du Bois, Banks refused to cast Brown as an unadulterated hero. He gives us a human rather than mythic portrait with warts and all, a critical but sympathetic, an honest portrait of Brown that conveys deeper meaning than any other book on him. The troubled humanity with which Banks endows his protagonists gives new meaning to the concept of a rounded character. And that brings me to my last and most compelling reflection about Banks's work, the unmistakable and extraordinary beauty, the rhythmic cadence of his sentences, the structural precision of his plots, and the clarity of images and thoughts that the words reveal. That's not bad. That's not bad for that's not bad, man. So let me tell you what we got today. We got in store for us these volunteers who've come up here. We're going to follow that kind of presentation with their own helpful stuff. And I'm just going to introduce all three now, and then they're going to go in the order that they're seated here. I really am grateful all of you have taken time in your busy semester, some driving from a distance to come. So thank you very much. We're going to begin with Stephanie Paulsell, who's the Houghton Professor of Practice of Ministry Studies. Her PhD is from, where else? The University of Chicago. She's been at the Divinity School since 2001. Before coming to Harvard, she served as Director of Ministry Studies and Senior Lecturer in Religion and Literature at the University of Chicago, the Divinity School. She is the author of Honoring the Body, Meditations on a Christian Practice, and co-editor of The Scope of Our Art, The Vocation of the Theological Teacher. And all of us know in the Divinity School, we're looking forward to her next book. It's based on her research on Virginia Woolf and religion. So we're very much looking forward to what Stephanie has to say. Followed by Matthew Potts, Assistant Professor of Ministry Studies, newly arrived at the Divinity School. We couldn't be happier. PhD from Harvard University. He studies the theology and practices of Christian communities with a focus on the relationship among narrative, liturgy, and ethics. He seeks to analyze and interpret Christian sacramental practices while employing the sources of literature, literary theory, and Christian theology. We're looking forward to his forthcoming book on Cormac McCarthy and the Signs of Sacrament, Literature, Theology, and the Moral of Stories. So we're looking forward to hearing from him. We've been very grateful for Amy Hempel joining us. Has been a longtime colleague of Russell. She's a recipient of awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the United States Artists Foundation, and many other places. She's a celebrated writer. Her stories have appeared in Harper's, GQ, Vanity Fair. Her work has been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories and the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction. Her collected stories was named by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of 2007 and won the Ambassador Book Award for the Best Fiction of the Year. In 2009, she received the Pen Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story. We're very grateful to have her here with us today. Let me now turn the floor over to the three panelists and begin with my good colleague, Stephanie Paulsell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's great to see everyone. I want to thank you for being a part of this over this semester. It's great to get to this day because we were so excited about having Russell Banks and Amy Hempel with us. But I'm also sad that we're at the end of this workshop. So we're just going to have to find out who else is in Davíd Carrasco's Rolodex and see what else we can do to get together to talk about books we love, because it has been a lot of fun. In the last session of this workshop, when John Stouffer led us in a discussion of Russell Banks's novel Cloud Splitter, several participants noted Owen Brown's preoccupation with the story of the binding of Isaac from the 22nd chapter of Genesis. If Cloud Splitter is haunted by the near sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham, the lost memory of Skin is haunted by the near sacrifice of Abraham's great nieces by their father, Lot. In the 19th chapter of Genesis, when the men of Sodom come to the door of Lot's house to demand that he send out his male guests to be raped, Lot tries to appease the crowd by offering his daughters instead. Look, he says, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. As in the binding of Isaac, divine intervention prevents this sacrifice. Lot's guests, who are angels, yank Lot back inside the house and strike the men of Sodom blind so that they cannot find the door. In a novel that has so much to do with childhood, we see very few actual children in the lost memory of Skin. Children appear almost as rumors, shrouded in fog or history or unreality. There are the children we see dancing in and out of the artificial mist of a fog machine, half naked and dead-eyed, as adults stand around watching and a director yells cut. It's not clear if what's being filmed is child pornography or some kind of commercial. In the novel's view, though, there's clearly not much difference between the two. Both manipulate adult erotic attraction to children in order to sell something. Both aim to create consumers that will spend and spend and spend. Then there are the indigenous Calusa and Tequesta children that the kid sees in a dream when he is sleeping on a houseboat in the great Pensacola swamp. In his dream, these children are being rounded up by Spanish soldiers and shipped off to slavery in Cuba. It is a dream from which he has difficulty waking. And then there are the children that the state senator Lawrence Somerset believes he will see when he opens the door of his motel room in his underwear. He thinks he has arranged with a crack-addicted mother to rent her 7- and 9-year-old daughters for the night. But the mother turns out to be an undercover cop, and Lawrence Somerset ends up under the causeway with the rest of the sex offenders. All of these sacrificed children, the real and the unreal, the dreamt of and the barely glimpsed, haunt this novel the way that Lot and his daughters haunt the Bible. The characters we see most clearly in this novel are all adults, but the marks of their childhood remain visible on their bodies, whether they are scrawny or buff or obese. The central character, known only as the kid, is the most childlike. He's 22, but frequently mistaken for a teenager, and he is small, only 5'5". He describes himself to himself as a fatherless white kid who graduated high school without ever passing a single test or turning in a single paper, a kid who could barely read and write or do math beyond the simplest level of arithmetic, who was hooked for years and maybe still was hooked on porn and jacking off and never had a girlfriend or a best friend and belonged to no one's posse. When Dolores Driscoll, the bus driver from the Sweet Hereafter, who makes a welcome appearance in this novel, meets the kid, he reminds her of the schoolboys she had known from her bus driving days, boys who are scrawny and short for their age, boys who couldn't make eye contact, boys who were bullied into a stunned silence, boys who were born to lose. Having turned to online pornography as an 11-year-old as a way of drowning out the sound of his mother having sex in the room next door, most of what the kid knows about human interaction comes from what he has seen on his computer screen. When in his early 20s, he finds himself talking to someone who may or may not be a 14-year-old girl in a chat room, the only way he knows how to address her is through the language of pornography. When he visits the home of a local professor and sees his living room full of books and CDs, the only thing he knows to compare it to is the set of a high-end porn film. It's the sex talk in the chat room and his subsequent attempt to visit the girl he believes he's talking to that gets him in trouble. Like the other children haunting this book, that girl herself is as ethereal as a dream. The kid sees a ponytailed silhouette setting out lemonade and cookies through a window, but she evaporates, only to be replaced by a man claiming to be her father and 5 police officers. After 6 months in jail, the kid is released into a world that fears and despises him. He's outfitted with an ankle bracelet for electronic surveillance, ordered to stay in town and to keep 2,500 yards between him and any place a child might go. Since, as the kid puts it, playgrounds and schools are pretty much everywhere, he has very few options and ends up living with other sex offenders under the causeway that runs between the mainland and the beach, a virgin sex offender who has yet to experience his first kiss. The story of the kid is, in part, the story of the pervasive ways we are formed as consumers from a very young age, and how easily the line between consumer and the consumed can be breached. When he is arrested, he goes from feeling like a dust bunny to feeling like a flattened image of a man seen on a computer screen. In an instant, he has gone from being the one watching to being the one watched. His image available to anyone with an internet connection, his story available to every prospective employer and landlord, the device on his ankle reporting his location in every moment. A pariah, an American untouchable, as Banks calls him, the kid is sacrificed on the altar of society's fear, a scapegoat. He is guilty not only of his crime, but guilty of being alive in a society that wishes he would just disappear. Although the world of the novel is haunted by the sacrifice of children, in the end, the story of Isaac and Lot's daughters are not the stories that the kid reaches for to understand his situation. He is instead drawn to the creation stories at the beginning of Genesis, both the stories of the creation of the world by God in 7 days and the story of humanity's fall from grace. When the kid inherits Lawrence Somerset's Bible after the police raid of the Causeway, he reads the story of Adam and Eve with such interest and attention that he begins to see his own story through its lens. The kid wonders, Banks writes, if it's possible that this whole tree of knowledge of good and evil thing was set up by God as a kind of prehistoric sex sting with the snake as a decoy. The story of the creation and the fall of the world remains a touchstone for the kid throughout the novel, a story by which he continues to interpret his life. And by the end of the novel, what he has come to understand is that every paradise is built on someone's suffering, and so that's not paradise after all, but a fallen world. The lawmakers of Calusa have tried to create a sort of paradise in which sex offenders are kept 2,500 yards from children at all times. But this paradise requires that all such offenders live under a causeway pushed out to the very edge of the sea, vulnerable to weather and violence and the contradictory impulse of the Calusa lawmakers to purge the camp periodically, to purge it violently, even though there is literally nowhere else for homeless sex offenders to go. The Pensacola swamp, where the kid finds a few brief days of solace, seems at first to be a paradise, with its peace and quiet, and that true friend of children, Dolores Driscoll, holding him in her compassionate gaze. But the swamp is suffused with the ghostly presence of Calusa Indians and Seminoles, the original inhabitants of the swamp, who appear in his dreams bearing witness to their suffering and enslavement. And he comes to see that even the digital paradise of internet pornography, by which he used to comfort himself, is also built on suffering, that the women on his computer screen are more than a set of orifices and a pair of hands. As he comes to see himself as real, he realizes that those women are also real, and that paying money to watch them being abused and degraded was a bad thing. It was like paying money to watch someone beat a dog. The sacrifice of Lot's daughters by those who should have protected them haunts every paradise the kid encounters, and once he can see them as real, he knows their suffering to be unbearable. For the kid, becoming real, becoming transformed and recreated, means moving from isolation to connection. As he lets himself feel a connection with others who are as real as he is, from the women in the hardcore pornography he watches on his computer to the Calusa Indians whose voices reach him in the Pensacola swamp, he moves from being a consumer to a three-dimensional man, not someone who exists on a screen for the consumption of others, but a human being of many parts, some of which are hidden inside of him. And that would make a sweet ending to this difficult novel, the kid's transformation through his connection to and growing compassion for Lot's vulnerable daughters everywhere. But Russell Banks pushes to the edges of this idea in the most challenging possible way. Because at the end of this novel, the connection that the kid feels most overwhelmingly and experiences most transformingly is the connection to his fellow sex offenders. As Lot's daughters become real to him, so does Lot, and so do the men banging on the door outside of Lot's home. When he plugs in the shackle on his ankle that allows him to be located and tracked by the state, he feels his connection to sex offenders everywhere with the force of a revelation. It takes half an hour to fully charge his monitor battery, and during that half hour, the kid feels intimately connected to the millions of other convicted sex offenders, young and old and in between, rapists and child abusers, and men who expose their genitals on a bus, public masturbators, voyeurs, and escalator gropers, compulsive seducers of teenage boys, coaches who couldn't keep their hands off their athletes, men who talked dirty in internet chat rooms to people they thought were teenage girls and then arranged to meet them for sex, fathers and uncles who drunkenly reached out for their teenage daughters as they passed by the sofa, porn addicts and fantasists lost in the misty zone between reality and imagery, no longer able to tell the difference, all of whom at this moment have plugged their electronic shackles into outlets and are sitting in the bedrooms, living rooms, and basements of houses and apartments and mobile homes, in garages, homeless shelters, public parks, in airports and train stations, in waiting rooms, offices, and the back rooms of fast food restaurants, and under causeways and overpasses, as if they were all trembling leaves on the branches, large and small, of a vast electrical tree that cast its shadow across the entire country. Banks makes us hear what the people to whom the kid feels so intimately connected have done, crime by crime. And in the middle of this long list, he places the kid's own crime. He is a man who talked dirty in an internet chat room to someone he thought was a teenage girl and then arranged to meet her for sex. The description is untempered by any reminders of the deprivations the kid endured as a child, his loneliness and isolation and bewilderment. It's just a raw description of what he did, without explanation. It's a bleak description, but it is a crucial part of the kid's recreation of himself. He knows himself to be guilty of a crime, but that crime is not the last thing to be said about him. It is not the whole truth about his life. He is trying to act his way into being a man with 3 dimensions, as he puts it, not just 2. An act of creation that he has come to understand as akin to God's creation of the world. It has to start, he thinks, way inside you in the black hole of antimatter that sits at the exact center of who you are. Diddle that spot even a little, and the rest will follow, and out of nothingness will come heat, light, and a strong wind blowing across the universe, and they will combine and bring into existence fire, earth, and water, and out of fire, earth, and water will emerge flesh, bone, and blood wrapped in his skin. The kid decides that his first move toward becoming the 3-dimensional person he wants to be is to believe a story that is hard to believe, the story told to him by another character, the professor. That act of belief is a leap of faith. He has no way of knowing whether the professor's story is really true or not. But believing it, he reasons, will make so much else possible. If he lives as if that story is true, he has a shot at becoming the fully human, connected person he wants to be. I think that Russell Banks is also asking us to believe a story about the inner lives and the full human mystery of what he calls pariahs of the most extreme sort, American untouchables, a caste of men ranked far below the merely alcoholic, addicted, or deranged homeless, men beyond redemption, care, or cure, both despicable and impossible to remove, and thus by most people simply wished out of existence. In his rewriting of the creation stories of Genesis, I I think he is asking us to interrogate our own stories of paradise and to ask whose suffering underwrites them. I think he is asking us to consider what difference it might make if we acted as if no one is beyond redemption, care, or cure. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to talk about Dolores Driscoll, actually, as well in my remarks, and return us to the sweet hereafter, which was the topic of our first meeting in this workshop. And in particular, I want to focus on two phrases that Dolores uses in that novel, two things she says. These phrases are bearing witness and fixing blame. The title of this workshop, of course, is Bearing Witness in the writings of Russell Banks. And so the organizers of it have sort of clued you in to the fact that this might be important. But to root it sort of in the text at hand, in the final section of the novel, it's The Sweet Hereafter, before she and her disabled husband, Abbott, head to the Midway for the demolition derby, if you remember, Dolores reflects on the days following the bus crash. And she recollects that after the accident, she says, I had attended the funerals, but alone, without even Abbott to accompany me. It was a way of bearing witness, I guess you could call it. I kept to myself, spoke to no one, and left immediately after the services. It was just something I had to do, something crucial between me and the children. I don't think the people, the adults, quite wanted me there among them, which was understandable, but I had to do it. For the children who, if they could have spoken for themselves, would surely have asked me to attend their funerals and say a prayer for each of their dear departed souls. And I did. They would have thought me cowardly if I'd stayed home instead. Dolores believes that she must bear witness somehow, whatever that phrase means in this particular instance. She thinks that she must speak for the children because they cannot speak for themselves, and despite the pain that it causes her. And when we think about this, I think it's hard not to see a double meaning in this phrase, bearing witness. Because to bear witness must mean not just to offer a witness, but also to suffer a witness, to endure the pain of a witness. Because to bear a thing can mean to carry it in offering, but also to suffer it, to endure it as a burden. And this additional, and I think somewhat hidden meaning demands further consideration from us, I think, especially when we consider how this novel's relatively spare plot happens to turn almost entirely upon the false, or we might say fictional, testimony of a witness, Nicole Burnell. And it might demand even further consideration when we recall what implications this bearing a false witness has for Dolores Driscoll, what Nicole's lie means for her. One can't help but be reminded of Mr. Banks's, the title of his lecture tonight on sacrifice. And I'll say a bit more about sacrifice in a few minutes. The other phrase of Dolores is that I think that we must consider is one that arises very early in the novel, but which I believe echoes throughout it in various ways. Just as she's beginning in that first chapter to recount the events of that day, the events preceding the bus crash, she tells us that fixing motives is like fixing blame. The further away from the act you get, the harder it is to single out one thing as having caused it. In some ways, this novel is just about fixing blame in the wake of disaster, about the struggle of this community to make sense of an unspeakable tragedy and to do so by assigning some responsibility for it. The town of Sam Dent attempts to fix, that is to mend, the horror of this bus crash by fixing, that is assigning blame for the bus crash, by giving it some sense through a coherent story or a reliable witness, a story and a witness, by the way, that Nicole finally offers and bears. But if the novel is this, if it's the story of a sense-making, then it's also a meditation upon the intractability of senselessness, too. About the absolute impossibility of really finally fixing blame, of affixing or assigning blame in any simple way to human persons or human tragedies. And so I think the novel also asks us another question about the nature of blame fixing. That is, whether the fixing of blame might somehow also become the mending of blame. Whether there might be some way to mend or fix the necessary and sacrificial practices of sense-making and blame fixing that we always undertake in the wake of tragedy. In other words, I'd like to suggest that the hidden meanings of these phrases of bearing witness and of fixing blame are meant to hang together in this novel, and that the way they hang together should have profound impact for us, both as readers of fiction, but also as students of religion, around questions of sacrifice, redemption, atonement, and forgiveness. So this notion of bearing witness in service of fixing blame is most fully realized in the character of Mitchell Stevens. And you remember Mitchell Stevens was a character we focused upon in our first workshop. And when he visits Sam Dent, he's talking about his reasons for going. And he arrives full of righteousness, self-righteousness and rage and anger. And he says, "That winter morning when I picked up the paper and read about this terrible event in that small town upstate with all those kids lost, I knew instantly what the story was. I knew at once that it wasn't an accident at all. There are no accidents. I don't even know what the word means, and I never trust anyone who says he does." There's always a reason for tragedy, Stevens says, and usually, he says, the reason is greed. And so the only way to check that greed is to use that greed, to make it cheaper for the corner cutters to build the bus with the extra bolt, or to add that extra yard of guardrail through the remunerative power of the law. And so Stevens goes in search of what he needs to prove his case: witnesses. In order to hold somebody accountable, in order to settle the accounts, he needs someone to give an account. He needs the story, the true story, in his words, the one which exposes the truth of the mishap. He needs that story to be told. To redeem this loss, he needs the right accounting. And what makes him a skilled and very wealthy personal injury lawyer is his capacity for finding and coaching the right kind of witnesses. I should also flag here, though I won't pursue it, how the language of commerce always surrounds these discussions: accounts and accounting and accountability and the redeeming of loss. And I wonder if Mr. Banks will tell us more about that tonight at his lecture. The law, Stevens demands, makes sense of and aims to redeem losses. And if it can do so, and it can do so, as long as the witness given is told to the right person in the right way, a story Stevens calls the truth. And Stevens depends almost entirely upon Nicole Burnell to bear witness to that truth in this novel. So before turning more directly to Nicole, I want just to briefly note that this notion of submission to the law for the sake of sense or meaning or truth is an idea that recurs in various ways throughout postmodern thought. Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, each posit variations on this theme. But for my purposes today, I'd just like to reference the work of Judith Butler for a moment. And I don't want to wander too far afield or distract from the text at hand, from the sweet hereafter. But one of the claims of postmodern thought has been that the self, the subject, or the individual identity is always conditioned by language. We come to realize ourselves, who we are, and what we mean through language. But this is also to say that the condition of our identity always resides outside of ourselves, because all of our understanding depends upon language we have inherited, or that's been imposed on us from outside, and over which we have little control. As Butler writes, if I try to give an account of myself, if I try to make myself recognizable and understandable, then I might begin with a narrative account of my life. But this narrative will be disoriented by what is not mine, or not mine alone. And I will, to some degree, have to make myself substitutable in order to make myself recognizable. In other words, Butler is saying, I'll have to put myself into words not my own, words we share, but words which don't really belong to you or me, or at least belong to both of us, for you to recognize me as an identifiable subject. In this way, she continues, it is only in dispossession that I can and do give an account of myself. And the law is a prime example of this sort of maneuver, this movement. Under the law, the truth does exist, but only as long as its account can be accounted for under the law's own system of accounting. Thus, the witness must substitute the storytelling for the self. According to Butler, such a storytelling does not express a self, but takes the self's place. We have to understand that storytelling itself is an act of sacrifice. And this particular logic, I think, might shed some light upon Stephen's relationship with his daughter and the freedom from love he says that truth affords him, and the disturbing comfort he takes in the idea of holding a knife above her throat. So this notion of storytelling as sacrifice, of bearing witness and giving an account of oneself as a form of submission, offers us a fascinating lens through which to read the character of Nicole Burnell. By the time Nicole goes to the courthouse to give her deposition, she has already decided the lawsuit that Stevens is trying to undertake, it must be stopped. She's eavesdropped on a conversation between her parents and Billy Ansell, and Billy's trying to persuade them to drop the suit. And Nicole says in that moment, and remember again, Nicole has been sexually abused by her father. And in that moment, Nicole says, at that moment, I hated my parents more than I ever had. I hated them for all that had gone before. Daddy for what he knew and had done, and Mommy for what she hadn't known and hadn't done. But I also hated them for this new thing, this awful lawsuit. The lawsuit was wrong, purely and in God's eyes. Why couldn't they see that? Why couldn't they just stand up like good people and say to Mr. Stevens, no, forget the lawsuit. We'll get by somehow on our own. It's too harmful to too many people. Because Nicole realizes that blame can only be fixed in this harmful legal way if it is not already fixed elsewhere, at the courthouse she lies and says Dolores was speeding and was responsible for the accident. But what's really interesting here is that this substitution of a fault, this false witness before the law, also somehow reveals another truth between Nicole and her father. Worried that her lie may have caused trouble for Dolores, she asks her father if Dolores will be arrested or sued in the wake of her testimony, and he replies, no, nobody wants to sue Dolores. She's one of us. Everybody knows she's suffered enough. Nicole replies, but everyone will blame her now, won't they? Most will, yes. Those that don't know the truth will blame Dolores. People have got to have somebody to blame, Nicole. But we know the truth, Nicole says, don't we? Yes, her father says. We know the truth, Nicole, you and I. They're not talking about the bus crash anymore. In this substitution of guilt, wherein Nicole sacrifices her story for another story, she also manages to substitute one truth for another and to reveal that truth to her father in a powerful way. Her false witness fixes blame. But if she's done this, if she's submitted to this regime of law, this regime of truth that the law requires and manipulated it to her own purposes, she's also given an account of herself given an account that sacrifices somebody else, right? The story she offers, for all it achieves, still involves a sacrifice because it fixes the blame for all the sadness upon maybe the most likable person in the novel, Dolores Driscoll. Of course, at the end of the novel, which I invited you to read for this workshop, Dolores doesn't know this when she goes to the midway to watch the demolition derby. She takes her place at the top of the grandstand with her disabled husband, Abbott, and then an inebriated Billy Ansell comes up and sits next to them. And then Nicole shows up, and everybody applauds politely, and they carry Nicole in her wheelchair up the grandstand as well. And when this happened, Billy tells the Driscolls that Stevens couldn't get Nicole to testify the way he wanted her to. And so he says, it looks like we won't be seeing any lawsuits here after all, which is fast bringing this town back together. That girl has done us all, every person in this town, a valuable service, even you, Abbott, even you, Dolores, believe it or not. And they don't know what he's talking about, so they press him and try to get him to say more, and he's kind of drunk, and he doesn't want to, but eventually he just says what happened, that Nicole blamed Dolores for the accident. And this occasions a significant and understandable sort of wave of ambivalent emotions in Dolores. On the one hand, she says, I felt as if a great weight I had been lugging around for 8 or 9 months since the day of the accident had been lifted from me. A huge stone or an albatross or a yoke. One minute it was there, And because it had been there for so long, I had grown used to it, and the next minute it was gone, flown away, disappeared, and I was suddenly able to recognize the terrible weight I had been carrying all these months. That's strange, isn't it? You'd expect me to feel angry, maybe, unjustly accused and all that, but I didn't. Not at all. I felt relieved, and therefore grateful. Grateful to Billy Ansell for revealing what Nicole had done, and grateful to Nicole for having done it. Grateful for having wrongly been accused. But then on the other hand, as Dolores watches her old station wagon, Boomer, which was also the old town bus, as she watches it kind of rally and win the demolition derby, she says she feels utterly and permanently separated from the town of Samden. She says she feels as if she and all the victims of the crash are citizens of a wholly different town now, as if we were a town of solitaries living in a sweet hereafter. And no matter how the people of Sam Dent treated us, whether they memorialized us or despised us, whether they cheered for our destruction or applauded our victory over adversity, they did it to meet their needs, not ours. Which, since it could be no other way, was exactly as it should be. In other words, Dolores realizes that she's been made sacrifice. That she's been made into a sacrifice to serve the town's need, to make some sense of the crash, to fix some blame. In some ways, she's realizing what her husband Abbott said to Mitchell Stevens earlier in the novel when he says to Stevens, blame creates comprehension. But she sees here that comprehension comes at a cost. To comprehend this loss, Sam Dent has sacrificed Dolores. It's a dark and somewhat tragic conclusion to a darkly tragic tale, which, as Dolores has said, is probably exactly as it should be. But there's another thing that Abbott had said to Mitchell Stevens, too, a thing which I think further complicates this novel's ending. Abbott had also said to Stevens that the people of Sam Dent, who have known Dolores all her life, they can decide on her guilt or innocence. And if Dolores has committed a crime, then that crime is against the people of Sam Dent, not the state. And so they will be the ones who decide her punishment. And what's interesting is after Dolores feels so separated from the town, she stands up to go, she rises to lead the derby, and having been sacrificed by Nicole and by the town, she gets up and she's going down the steps, and then the men of the town just get up and they help her carry Abbott down those stairs in this gesture of courtesy and common good, and one that mirrors Nicole's arrival at the grandstand as well. The punishment Dolores will receive, it seems, is to remain a part of this town and to feel the courtesy, even the care, of its people. All this, I think, gestures towards something poignant and important for us as readers of this book. As Frederick Jameson has said, we cannot not narrate. We cannot but tell stories which aim to make sense of a sometimes senseless world. This novel reminds us of that. But even if we cannot resist the compulsion to bear witness and to fix blame, we might also recognize that the stories we tell always involve a sacrifice of sorts, and that our making sense of the past should also reckon with the sacrificial victims of our sense-making and our blame-fixing. In other words, even as we offer witness and assign blame, we must leave space for the suffering our witnessing might generate. We must remain prepared to mend the wounds our blame will often additionally inflict. And now, having heard Stephanie's talk, I can't help hearing resonances with this. We cannot but speak, as Judith Butler has written, but if we speak and try to give an account from this place of uncertainty, of openness, of vulnerability, we will not be irresponsible, or if we are, we will surely be forgiven. This gives a sense of what I think is at stake in this sad novel and in its deeply unsatisfying, although altogether appropriate and moving conclusion. Because however important this lesson might be for readers of Mr. Banks's fiction in general, I believe it may be especially relevant to students of religion, like me, and to adherents of Christianity, like me again. The Christian tradition comes in for some fair criticism in this book. As Billy Ansell says, the Christians talk about God's will and all, but that only made me angry, although I suppose I'm glad they were able to comfort themselves with such talk. But I could not bring myself to attend any of the memorial services, that the various churches in Sam Dent and the neighboring towns invited me to. It was enough to have to listen to Reverend Dreiser at the twins' funeral. He wanted us all to believe that God was like a father who had taken our children for himself. Some father. The only father I had known was the one who abandoned his children to others. And Dolores says something less harsh, but very similar. The religious explanation is just an explanation. For her and for Billy, as Billy says, the religious explanation is just another sly denial of the facts. A different way of putting this might be to say that the religious explanation is just another bearing of witness, just another fixing of blame, which is implicated in all the same confusions and complexities of offering and suffering, of fixing and mending that any other narrative explanation might be. And to be sure, the offensive theodicies of God's will for dead children, here paraphrased by Billy, as well as the nonsensical atonement theologies of a son sacrificed to the wrath of a loving father, also here referenced by Billy. These theories, which Christians have sometimes used in the wake of tragedy, whether that tragedy is a bus accident in the Adirondacks or a shooting in Connecticut or the crucifixion of a man in Judeo-Palestine. All of these explanations seem to be as desperate for comprehension, sense, law, and justice as anything Mitchell Stevens says in this book. We cannot not narrate, and once we do, we can't avoid the sacrifices and sins each telling will entail. But as the grandstand on the Midway teaches us, there might yet be more to this story. Or at least there might be more to our story and more to what we are obliged to do with our story once it's been told. Because even if we cannot undo the past and cannot but fix blame upon a past we can't undo, we might still be able to fix the blame that we have fixed upon the past. We might still find a gracious way of living into the future with our story and with one another in mutual care, concern, and community. Nicole's story at her deposition demands a sacrifice, yes, but it's a sacrifice Sam Dent can live with, one even Dolores Driscoll can live with, unlike all the other stories, legal, religious, whatever, which are on offer in that town. Nicole's story is a fiction, but it's a livable fiction. It's a fiction with a future, a fiction that stands up and escorts Abbott down the steep stairs of that grandstand with Dolores at its side while they depart the fair. Whatever else the Christian story says about sacrifice, I think it says something like this about sacrifice too, and associates with these necessary narrative wounds such gracious and difficult and perhaps impossible aspirations as forgiveness and redemption and maybe even resurrection. Insofar as fiction, and Mr. Banks's fiction in particular, reminds me of such gracious aspirations, then for me at least, it remains a necessary and a religious sort of fiction, a religious sort of storytelling, and one for which, like Dolores, I am grateful.
Yeah. Do you want to? Russell?
Yes. I didn't bring a copy of my Yeah, transplant. That's good. That's good. Well, I just as soon sit quietly and try to recover from your brilliant and beautiful analyses and discussions of my work. I'm so very grateful to you for it, both of you. I hope that we can continue a conversation together. I'm also just want to thank David Carrasco for inviting me here and for hosting me while I'm here, and thank you all too for participating in this program. I was able to watch the last meeting on video, and I wish I had been there. Actually, it looked, it was very engaging and inspiring even. Amy asked me to read a story from from the last book, from a permanent member of the family for about 10 minutes or so. It takes about that long, or maybe 15. And then I think we were going to talk together. Is that how we're going to do that? All right. And then we were going to open it up. Is that correct? Okay. All right. Well, the story, one of the two stories that's short enough for that period, is a story called Transplant. The crushed gravel footpath wound uphill from the parking lot through a grove of poplar trees. From the passenger seat of the van, Howard spotted the monument at the top of the hill, a head-high granite pylon that marked the site of a Puritan massacre of a band of Narragansett Indians. He made out the slender figure of a woman standing next to the pylon. She wore jeans and a bright yellow nylon poncho with the hood up. He turned to the woman in the driver's seat and said, "I don't know, Betty. It's farther than I usually walk, you know." "Can't turn back now," she said. She reached across him and opened his door and handed his cane to him. "It's not so far. She's waiting for you. Maybe you could go up and bring her down here instead. Maybe you could pretend she doesn't exist and go sit on the porch at the house like an invalid and watch the sunset over the harbor. You need the exercise, Howard. Besides, you set this up. This is your deal." "No, it's Dr. Horowitz's deal," he said. He grabbed his cane and eased himself from the van. The whole thing is crazy, he thought. I am an invalid. I need to be left alone. This woman shouldn't bring her troubles to me. I've got enough of my own. He stood unsteadily for a few seconds, then squared his shoulders and slowly made his way up the path toward the woman in the yellow poncho. This was not how he had expected the day to play out. Around 10 that morning, Betty had entered his bedroom without knocking as usual and had drawn back the curtains and let sunlight flood the room. From his bed, Howard saw the sloping meadow below and then the harbor and the long, low peninsula on the far side, the white steeple of the church and the colonial-era waterside houses and docks of the fishing village, and his irritation, as usual, passed. "Let's check the vitals," Betty said. "See if you're ready for a walk in the park today. Doctor's orders." She pushed up his pajama sleeve and began taking his blood pressure. She was an abrupt, pink, square-faced woman with graying, straw-colored hair, cut in a page boy with Prince Valiant bangs. Her hair looked ridiculous to Howard. She was in her mid-40s, a few years younger than he. After some initial difficulty, they had become friends. Her short, athletic body was attractive, but in a masculine way that was not sexy to him, and he was glad of that. Relieved is more like it. Betty treated him as if he were an adolescent boy, but he felt like a very old man locked in an even older man's body. He liked her crisp, no-nonsense personality and her bark of a laugh when he resisted her attempts to get him up and moving or make him follow his strict diet, drink 8 glasses of water a day, walk in the house without the cane. A certain degree of irritation gave him pleasure. Her refusal to treat him the way he felt, along with the daily sight of the harbor and the marina and town on the other side of it, cheered him. Very little else cheered him, however. "You got a phone call to make," she said, and stuck the thermometer under his tongue. "Dr. Anthea Horowitz wants to talk to you." "What kind of name is that anyhow, Anthea? She's Jewish, right?" She pulled out the thermometer, checked it, and shook it down. 97.9. BP is 130/78. You're still functional, Howard. "I don't know. Scandinavian, maybe? Could be Jewish, I guess. How many times have you asked me about her name, anyhow? You got a problem with Jewish women doctors? Give me the damn phone," he said. She passed him the telephone. "Don't forget your morning pills, your morning meds," she said, and pointed to the glass of water and plastic cup of pills on the bedside table. "Breakfast in 15, mister." More like brunch, actually, she noted, and headed for the kitchen. Since he'd left the hospital, every morning had been the same. He knew at once where he was and why, but couldn't remember exactly how he had got there. It wasn't the painkillers. He'd been off them for 5 weeks almost. It had to be the residue of the anesthesia. They say it takes a month for every hour you're anesthetized before you're normal, and he'd been knocked out for 8.5 hours. He did the math again. It was mid-May. The operation had been January 6th. He wouldn't be clear of the effects of the anesthesia until September. There were still large blank patches in his memory that shifted locale daily, unpredictably. Every morning when he woke, he remembered suddenly something that the day before he'd been unable to recall, his cell phone number or the name of his daily newspaper. Then an hour or two later, he'd notice a batch of new blanks. He couldn't remember the brand of car he owned, his social security number, the name of the mysterious leafy green vegetable in the refrigerator. The patch over his move in March from the hospital to his ex-mother-in-law's summer house had stayed, however, week after week, month after month. He had no memory of the actual event. That worried him. Howard knew the facts. He had been told them by his ex-wife Janice and her mother, and by his surgeon Dr. Horowitz and his nurse Betty O'Hara, and could pass that information on to anyone who wanted to know why he was living alone in a seaside summer cottage on Cohasset Harbor. The explanation was simple. He couldn't return to his own house in Troy, New York, because he had undergone the transplant in Boston and had to stay nearby, monitored by Dr. Horowitz and her staff while recovering from the surgery. Betty tested his blood daily and drove him to Boston weekly to be examined for telltale signs of rejection or infection. His insurance, although it covered Betty's salary, wouldn't pay for an apartment or house in the area, and he was currently unemployed. He had been a publisher's representative, basically a traveling salesman for the Northeast region, a job he was no longer capable of holding. He had fallen on hard times, as he liked to say. Luckily, drawing from some half-filled well of residual affection, his ex-wife had talked her mother into giving him the use of her summer house. He knew all that, although he couldn't remember actually moving in, taking up residence. He had no problem remembering Dr. Horowitz's office number, however. In the last year, while waiting for an available heart, he had called her office hundreds of times and dozens of times since the surgery. He sat up in bed and dialed and told the receptionist that he was returning a call from Dr. Horowitz. A few seconds later, she came on the line. Howard? Yes, hello. How are you feeling this week, Howard? She sounded tentative to him, less assured than usual. Not a good sign. Okay, I guess. No complaints. Why, anything wrong with my tests? No. Everything's hunky-dory. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm not bothering you, am I? Can you talk? Yeah, sure. What's up, Doc? If she could say everything was hunky-dory, he could call her Doc. Howard, I'm passing on a request. Not a usual request, but one I have to honor. You understand? Yeah, sort of. The wife, the widow of the man who donated your heart. My heart. Yes, she wants to meet you. They were both silent for a moment. Christ. She wants to meet me? Yes. Why? I haven't given her your contact information. I can't do that without your permission. I only agreed to convey her request, that's all. Why, though? Why does she want to meet me? I'm not sure I can handle that. I understand, Howard. I know you've been depressed. That's not unusual. I can prescribe something for it, you know. It's not like the heart's adopted and she's the birth mother. It's up to you. It's not all that uncommon, you know. What, being depressed after a heart transplant? That too, but no, the donor wanting to meet the recipient. She's not the donor, he said. All he knew about his heart before it became his was that it had belonged to a 26-year-old man who had died of head injuries suffered in a motorcycle accident. The man, a roofer in New Bedford, had been married, the father of a very young child, and a non-smoker, Dr. Horowitz had assured him. Howard placed his right hand onto his heart. and felt its sturdy beat. It's my heart, damn it. It belongs to Howard Bloom, not some poor kid who fell off his motorcycle, hit his head on a curb, and died. He said, I've got to think about it. Of course. She says she'll meet you anywhere you want. She's young, barely 22, and I take it she's alone in the world, except for her baby boy. My guess is she still hasn't accepted the death of her husband, hasn't found closure. It's not unusual. Closure. I don't know the meaning of the word, he said. He was thinking of his divorce from Janice 7 years ago, the end of a brief but perfect marriage, a marriage ruined by the affairs and dalliances that had resulted from his refusal to come in off the road and live and work close to home, maybe run a bookstore, turn himself into a domesticated man, a faithful husband because watched, a secure husband because watchful. But he'd spent 20 years on the road before falling in love with Janice, and after marrying her, continued sleeping 5 nights a week away from home. Howard believed that he had married too late, when he was too old to change his ways. He was attractive to women in spite of being a cold and selfish man, and he had betrayed Janice frequently, and finally Janice had betrayed him back and had fallen in love with one of her lovers, and now she was married to him and had 2 children with him, and that was that. When a terrible thing happens and it's your own damn fault, there's no closure, he thought. Whatever happened, you live with it. Alone, he had endured his 3 heart attacks, an open heart bypass surgery, and a year later, the steady deterioration of the organ itself, and now the transplant. All of it somehow the result of having ruined his marriage to Janice, the one truly good thing that had befallen him. He believed that none of it, the heart attacks, the surgery, the transplant, would have happened if it hadn't been for the divorce. It was a superstition, he knew, but he couldn't let it go. This young woman, though, had not caused her husband's accident, the terrible thing that had happened to her. It was her husband's fault. Maybe for her, closure, whatever that meant, was possible. I guess I owe her a lot, right? I mean, she's the one who made the decision to donate his organs. Dr. Horowitz asked where he would like to meet the woman. Her name was Penny McDonough, she said, from New Bedford, less than an hour's drive from his cottage on Cohasset Harbor. I don't want her to come here, he said. I'll ask Betty where's a good place nearby, someplace she can drive me to. I'll get back to you and set a time, he said. Tell her that I'm only good for a short visit. He neared the monument at the top of the hill, breathing hard, leaning heavily on his cane, his heart pounding. Whose heart was it, anyhow? Dear God, whose heart is inside me? It was not his own, but it was not someone else's either. Until this moment, Howard had managed not to ask that question. Now, since agreeing to meet this woman, he couldn't stop asking it, and he knew why he had avoided it for so long. There was no answer to the question, none. He was afraid that for the rest of his life he would not be able to say whose heart was keeping him alive. He walked to the side of the monument where the woman in the yellow poncho stood waiting. She was very slender, fragile-seeming, almost childlike, with small hands and thin, bony wrists, young enough to be his daughter, he thought. Instead of a woman's purse, she held a green cloth book bag. She had pale skin and large blue eyes and wore no makeup or jewelry that he could see. Short wisps of coppery hair crossed her forehead, and he remembered her name, Penny, and wondered what her real name was. Not Penelope, probably something Irish, he thought. I'm Howard Bloom, he said. I guess you're Penny? Mrs. McDonough, I mean? He extended his right hand, and she gave him hers, cold and half the size of his. Yes, thank you, Mr. Bloom, for agreeing to meet with me. She had a flat and South Shore accent. She looked directly at his eyes, but not into them, as if she had met him once long ago and was trying to remember where. I'm sorry you had to walk all the way up here from the car, she said. I wasn't sure it was you or I'd have come down. That's okay. I needed the exercise. She made a tight-lipped smile. Because of the surgery, yes. Are you all right? I mean, yes, I'm fine, he said, cutting her off. Listen, this is kind of uncomfortable for me, but I did want to be able to tell you how grateful I am for what you did. I don't know why you wanted to meet me, but that's why I wanted to meet you, to tell you, to thank you. You don't have to thank me. It's what Steve, my husband, it's what he would have wanted. Yeah, well, I guess I should thank him too. He paused for a moment. He must have been a good guy, thoughtful, right? She drew her bag in front of her as if about to open it. Yes. I have a favor I'd like to ask you, she said. May I? Yeah, sure. Why not? I want to listen to your heart, Steve's heart. Jesus. Listen to my heart? Isn't that a little weird? It would mean a lot to me, more than you can know. Please, just once, just this one time. She opened the bag and withdrew a black and silver stethoscope and extended it as if it were an offering. I don't know. It feels a little creepy to me. You can understand that, can't you? Howard looked down the hill toward the car. He didn't want Betty to see this. He didn't want anyone to see this. A few yards beyond the parking lot, the narrow road followed the rock-strewn shore. A thickening bank of clouds had blotted out the sun, and an offshore wind had raised a chop in the blue-gray water. Please, she said in a low voice, please let me do this. She pushed back her hood and laid the curved rubber-tipped ends of the stethoscope over her shoulders and around her neck. Howard said nothing. He merely nodded, and she placed the tips into her ears and stepped toward him. Will you undo your shirt? He pulled his flannel shirt loose of his trousers and unbuttoned it all the way down. Why the hell am I letting her do this? I could just refuse and walk away, he thought. What about my T-shirt, he asked. Want me to lift it up? No, she said firmly. I don't want to see it. The chest piece at the end of the stethoscope was the size and shape of a small biscuit, and swiftly, as if she'd rehearsed, the young woman placed it directly over the incision in Howard's chest. Then she closed her eyes and listened. Tears ran down her cheeks. Howard put his arms around her shoulders and drew her closer to him and felt himself shudder and knew that he was weeping too. Several moments passed, and then the woman removed the tips of the stethoscope from her ears and pressed the left side of her head against Howard's chest. They stood together for a long time, buffeted by the wind off the harbor, holding each other, listening to Howard's heart. A light rain had started falling. In the parking lot below, Betty walked around the front of the van, checked her watch, and gazed up at the couple. After a few seconds, she walked back to the driver's side, got into the vehicle, and continued to wait. That's the end of that. How should we do this?
Why don't you stick around?
All right, I'll just stick around.
Because I will, yeah. Thank you, Russell. Wonderful reading and wonderful takes on his work. I'm going to say just a little bit about the two stories I think most of you have read and really ask Russell Banks about a couple of things, and maybe you'll step back if you to answer them, and then as David said, you are welcome to ask him questions yourself. Several years ago, at another writers' conference, this not Bread Loaf, but the Sewanee Writers' Conference at the University of the South, outside of Nashville, I had the very good luck to be paired with Russell Banks to teach, I guess it was 5 workshops over 12 days. They put a more, the bigger name and then the smaller name together, and it was great fun. And I certainly know that I learned as much as and any of the students. And one of the most important things I remember learning from Russell Banks in that class was that the more consistent a character is, the less credible. Okay? Another way to think of that is, as a friend of mine put it succinctly, and is truer than or. We're not this way or that way. We're this way and that way. And this was a profound thing for me to realize, and I certainly rushed to try to apply it in my own stories. So there's proof of this in Former Marine, which was the first story. It's a story that opens this most recent collection. Both of the stories that I chose for you to read feature fathers with their children. Former Marine, you remember, it's the father of 3 boys. In a permanent member of the family, it's a father of 4 daughters from 2 marriages. So the title character, the former Marine, has remained a devoted father to 3 boys after the boys' mother walked out on the family when they were small, when the boys were small. He took his duty very seriously. He's absolutely devoted. He's been selfless. To use the word that's come up earlier, he made sacrifices for them into adulthood and continued when the boys were adults. He's more than responsible, and yet he robs banks. He comes to the point where he robs banks. Now, there is a ruined economy to look at. We're talking about fixing blame. Well, let's look at the economy in which such a thing can happen and make sense. That's one of my one of the things I just can't quite believe how he did it. I can't understand how Russell Banks managed to make this seem logical. But it does seem logical in a way, that the solid citizen becomes a criminal. And there's a phrase I want to read that I found very moving. He wanted to take, this is the former Marine, the man, he wanted to take impeccable care of his sons, and he did. And after the boys grew up and no longer needed him to take care of them, he planned on continuing to hold the family together by being able to take impeccable care of himself. That was the long-range plan. Okay? So, you all know the expression, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And the plan goes bad, it goes off, and I think that he says something in the story like, well, you know the economy's bad when an auction house is, laying off its employees, that he's lost a job. So I'm always interested in fiction that looks at loyalties. How much does anybody owe anybody else? To me, this is endlessly interesting. And there are people who will say, well, the only time you should, it's ever good to put somebody's needs before your own are if it's your children. You put your children's needs before yours. So, Russell, I wanted to ask you, in this amazing transformation of the responsible, devoted father into bank robber, because he can't take care of himself. I wonder if you could talk about how that issue of loyalty to his sons, to himself, to how that came about, how you came to look at it in that way. And I'm going to trade seats with you for that.
I'll try to address some of those questions and thoughts. That story is based actually on a newspaper clipping that I came across, that I clipped many years ago. I have a habit of just clipping and throwing into a drawer things that attract me for no good reason or no reason I can identify at the time. And there happened to be a story, I think it was in the Times, maybe it was one of those, a small story about a man who had robbed a series of banks in Illinois, I believe it was, and his sons. He had several sons, 2, I think, and not 3. I wanted 3 just because story writers like 3 of everything if possible, and keep the kind of fairy tale motif alive in that story or fable. And I was the 3 sons, and the 2 sons in the reality uncovered the father's crimes in the home. They had gone to the father's home, and then there had been bags of money or something there. Anyhow, and the real problem was, and this comes back to your question, because that was what I think attracted me to that clipping, was the son's situation, their responsibility. What's their responsibility? Because it turned and I made them law officers. One is a prison guard, and the other is a state trooper, and the other one is, I think, a local cop. But they're all like, he was a former Marine, and these are as close to being former Marines as possible because they're law officers. And now they've discovered their father has robbed banks. So the real moral question is for them. The moral question doesn't really exist for the father in the same way at all. It comes back to some of the questions that you were raising, I think, as well, fixing blame and also sin versus crime, too, criminal behavior. So that's why I wanted to write that story. I wanted to examine the role of the sons in that story and present them with a moral dilemma and let that unfold the narrative, drive the narrative. The father's situation is essentially static, and the action really arises from the son's discovery. I mean, there's a basic kind of truism about short stories. They begin with conflict, but conflict is static. It's simply balanced. One thing is posed against another, and there's no movement, no drama, no motion to the story, to the narrative, no narrative, until you complicate things. And the complication in that story is the discovery by the sons of the father's being a bank robber. How he got to become a bank robber is another question, and that's really just a plausibility question. Yeah, there was an awful lot of bank robbers in the Depression era who were very respectable bourgeois people before the Depression, and ended up bank robbers. I wrote this story just recently, so it was at the height of the recession, and I could easily imagine how a man with a certain amount of pride, especially, would end up robbing banks just to make the payments on his house, to pay the bank back. I don't know if that addresses the questions. Yeah.
I'm going to scramble back up here. There's another very short quote. Yeah, stay here. Stay here. There's another quote in here, again, very moving to me, where when the sons, 3 sons, again, all in law enforcement, one says, Buzz says, Dad, what the hell do you want us to do? What do you think we should do? What's the right thing here, Dad? And exactly, so they can only do one thing if they're going to do the moral thing. They can turn in their father. And they're very, well, or not, but they're very relieved when he has somebody shaking her head. No, that's not the only thing they can do. The moral thing, according to their job. But you indicate they are relieved when he hands it over, the money, and says, oh, let's just sleep on it. They don't know it's here. They'll sleep on it in the morning. You take it in. So you obviously felt that was that made sense for what the sons would do.
Well, actually, I haven't read the story in a couple of years, but I felt that that's unresolved, and he's really left it with them what to do. He's not going to fight with them. He's not going to lie anymore, and he stops lying at that point, I think, in the story. And so it's unresolved what they're going to do. And so as they walk out, they go out into the parking lot, I think it's still unresolved what they're going to do. And then he takes the action of the story back to himself. And I don't want to well, I guess most of you have already read the story, so you know how it ends. Yeah, it ends badly. But, but just in terms of structure, of the narrative structure, I think what happens is that the resolution is postponed until he takes the responsibility back away from them. And finally, it goes back to some of the things you were pointing to in your analysis of the Sweet Hereafter, particularly. It's he takes responsibility for the act and takes the blame and fixes it and sacrifices himself essentially for them and saves them the terrible responsibility that they would have had to face the next morning when they came back to the hospital.
Exactly, and that's what I think it's so beautifully done, the back and forth. It could go either way, but by taking his own life, he absolves them of that awful chore, the awful decision. And I see in that a kind of ultimate loyalty to the children he protected. Relieving them in this final and absolute way, but it's weird to say that his suicide is an act of a kind of generosity, but it oddly is.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's what I hoped would occur. You know, and I know you know because you write such wonderful stories and you go through the same experience that I do, which is that when you begin a story, you haven't a clue where it's going because anything is possible. You've got unlimited number of options. You know, when you write one sentence, however, you've just cut in half all the options. Then you write a paragraph, and now you've cut down by a quarter all the options. And the whole process of writing is a matter of narrowing your options till you get down to the very end, and you've only got 2 left. And you can begin to feel the smoke coming out of your ears because you're not sure which way you're going to go until you're writing that last couple of sentences. And this is a classic case of that for me. I mean, a very conscious case.
Did that surprise you at the end? Did you, at what point in the story, if you even recall,
Yeah.
did you think, oh, that's how it must end?
I didn't know how it was going to end until they left the hospital.
Oh.
When they go out of his room, and then I remembered the gun, just as he remembered the gun. You see, that's it. You're all the characters in the story, and I remembered, oh yeah, there's a gun up there. Wow. And that gave me 2 options, you know, and so, but that moment in the writing of a story, isn't it the most exhilarating moment, but also in some ways the most painful one because you're down to it. And what you decide to do, which option you choose at the very end, it really has to reflect your view of the universe, really, a much larger view than not this character, this situation, this moment in narrative time, but also the way you think things are in the world, you know?
And I love that you said it, that's when it occurred to you, because if you remember, that's almost the very end of the story. And that it surprised you, it surprised me. I think it's not something you really see coming. I didn't see it coming.
Well, if you're Chekhov, you saw that.
If you're Chekhov, you got it.